And on the surface of things, yes, he's been successful, however you want to define that term. I mean, certainly in material terms and in terms of his current position, but at what cost? And I would suggest it was at the cost of him, and sadly now, all of us.
Who did he learn to become for his dad?
He learned to become the killer you mentioned, the man who needs to succeed at all costs, who recognizes that other people are expendable, who does not need to take responsibility, who will do anything to get attention, financial rewards, and to win.
You write that he knows deep down that he is nothing of what he claims to be. He knows he has never been loved. Does children love him?
I don't know if that's true. I don't know my cousins very well. They're much younger than I am. And I guess it also depends on what that means.
What does it mean to you?
To me, love means being connected to another human being in a very deep way, being able to share things with them and trust them. In terms of a parent for a child, it means sacrificing for them and accepting them no matter what, and never putting them in a position to lie for you or cheat for you or take from you. And I don't know that most people in my family understand that.
You paint the picture of a family that is, I guess in your words, malignantly dysfunctional. How so?
From very early on, the kids were separated, not physically, but emotionally and psychologically. They were never able really to count on each other in ways that mattered. They were in competition with each other for resources that felt over time scarce, which is absurd.
Donald figured out what his father wanted.
Yes.
His mother, not so much.
No. No. She was in some ways very much a creature of that generation. The gender divide in my family was stark even for the 40s and 50s. She had very little to do with the boys. It was almost as if the boys were my grandfather's purview and the girls were hers. I think from quite early on, Donald just didn't expect much from her. He knew, I think by the time he was sent to New York Military Academy, that she wasn't going to stand up for him. And after that very tragic year when she was quite ill and inaccessible, when he was only 2.5, I don't think the rift was ever repaired.
You describe her as being more or less at her wit's end with Donald before he's sent to the military academy.
Yeah.
How so?
He didn't listen. He didn't respect her. I believe that because of that initial rift, which wasn't her fault, you know, she was extraordinarily ill. She was in and out of the hospital for 6 to 12 months. And after that, I don't believe that she was attended to properly. You know, her physical well-being was perhaps addressed, but her psychological well-being was not. And for whatever reason, she was not able to repair what that absence had wrought. So as he grew older, I think that he just didn't know how to relate to her, couldn't trust her. And what I'm sure he experienced as an excommunication to boarding school was probably the last straw.
He described, I interviewed him on Mother's Day a few years back. He said she was a warm, loving, and generous person. It was his father who was the hard one. Yet you tell a story of going to the White House in April of 2017 and noticing what's on the desk behind
Yes.
the president.
Yes. Yeah, it was pretty striking. And to be honest, I didn't notice until I saw the picture my brother had taken of me while I was sitting behind the Resolute desk. And there was my grandfather right over my shoulder. So I had, of course, heard the conversation that Donald had with Marianne, maybe you should get a picture of mom on your desk, and his saying, oh yeah, somebody get me a picture of mom. But it wasn't until I saw that image of my grandfather hovering in the background that I realized how striking it was, that my grandmother was nowhere to be seen, not even an afterthought, really. Although, of course, a picture was gotten, and I believe it's still there now.
Tell me about your father at his best.
Unfortunately, I can only do that through other people. By the time I was born, he was quite ill.
Alcohol.
Yes. Which, caused all other kinds of illnesses too. And because my family, for reasons that are rather complicated, were very invested in portraying my father as a loser, somebody who didn't toe the party line, somebody who betrayed my grandfather by not going into the business, and doing the entirely irresponsible thing of becoming a professional pilot for TWA at the dawn of the jet age. I, much to my shame, didn't understand what he had accomplished. I was often ashamed of him, not realizing that he had no support in the family and was treated as somebody who was damaged beyond repair and wasn't worth investing in any way, emotionally or otherwise.
You write, Donald, following the lead of my grandfather, and with the complicity, silence, and inaction of his siblings, destroyed my father.
Yeah, that was hard to write, much harder to witness. Partially because my dad, at his best, which unfortunately was in the 60s, the early 60s, was, not that it matters, but he was an extraordinarily handsome man. But he was also charming, but in a deep way, kind, generous, fiercely loyal, and beloved. I've been in touch with his friends who haven't seen him since college or even before that, and they remember him as the most wonderful human being they ever met. They remember the wonderful times they had together. He would put them in his Cessna and fly them to Bimini for the weekend to go fishing, or out east to Montauk. And it's extraordinary to hear almost 50 years later, 60 years later, what an indelible impression they made upon him and how fondly they still remember him.
You say that was a hard sentence to write. I left out the next sentence.
Okay.
Which is?
I'm sorry, I don't remember.
I can't let him destroy my country.
Yes. Yeah, I should remember that. That sounds pretty arrogant, so let me explain what I mean. I feel, as I write in the book, that there are so many parallels between the circumstances in which my family operated and in which this country is now operating. I saw firsthand what focusing on the wrong things, elevating the wrong people can do, the collateral damage that can be created by allowing somebody to live their lives without accountability. And it is striking to see that continuing now on a much grander scale. And what I was getting at there is that if I can do anything to change the narrative and to tell the truth, I need to do that because I don't believe the American people had the entire truth 4 years ago.
Why didn't you write the book 4 years ago?
I thought long and hard about saying something. I had a book wasn't in my head at that time. And honestly, it took me a while to take it seriously, to take the election, his part in it seriously. So even if I had thought of writing a book, there wouldn't have been time. But I did think of speaking out, knowing that it would have been quite risky to do. And then I realized there literally was nothing I could say at the time. Nothing stuck. You know, he insulted a Gold Star family. He called upon people at the Republican National Convention to come up with a Second Amendment defense against Hillary Clinton. And then, you know, by the time the Access Hollywood tape rolled around, I knew that if I had said anything, I would have been painted as a disgruntled, disinherited niece who just wanted her 15 minutes, which obviously is still being said about me now, but it wouldn't have made a...
That's exactly what the White House says. They say it's a book of falsehoods, that you're writing out of financial self-interest. Basically, you're lying for money.
It makes perfect sense that they would say that. Projection is a powerful thing. But if I had wanted money or revenge, I would have done this 10 years ago when it was infinitely safer. And he was still a very public figure. But neither one of those things interested me. I was living my life. I was beyond, you know, well beyond what had happened 20 years ago with my family. And it would have served no purpose other than getting revenge or maybe making some money.
And what do you say to the people who say America knew exactly what they were doing when they elected Donald Trump? He's kind of an open book. What don't they know?
Yeah, I don't think that's at all true, because outside of New York, I don't think people really quite understood the truth behind his business record and his financial failures, which are legion and serial. Beyond that, it was such a complex election. There was so much going on that I don't think the choices that people had to make were necessarily based on an honest appraisal. You know, there was so much interference from so many different sources. And the other thing that I think it's really important to realize, and that I certainly didn't realize before 2016, was just how enabled he would be, which maybe I should have seen coming. Because,
well, it's one of the things you write about. You say that basically he was enabled, institutionalized is your word, his whole life. What did you mean by that?
As I say, there's a through line from the House to Trump Management, which was my grandfather's company in Brooklyn, to the Trump Organization, which my grandfather helped Donald set up in Manhattan, to the White House. And those are all situations and circumstances in which Donald has always been protected and continues to be protected from his inadequacies, from his incompetence, from his lack of knowledge, from his failures. And he's always had support of more powerful people. He's always had people protecting him from his mistakes or from people who would try to hold him account. And he's always been amply financed. So, you know, as I also write, how do we gauge this man's ability to function in the real world, as he's never really had to? And that, to me, is quite terrifying.
You're a trained clinical psychologist.
Yes.
You come to the conclusion he's a narcissist.
Yeah, I explicitly avoid diagnosing him.
I was going to ask you about that. Have any
Sure.
qualms as a psychologist laying out the possible things that he could be suffering from?
No, I think it's useful, especially since so many other people have done it, and I thought it was important to address that, since it has been such an important issue, especially given the Goldwater rule versus the duty to warn that psychologists and psychiatrists have been grappling with. So I wanted to address all of that without explicitly saying, this is his diagnosis. He is not my patient. He's never been my patient. I do, however, have access to information about him that nobody else has had. So it was a lot easier for me to put the diagnoses that are out there in context of his developmental history.
Boil it down. What's the single most important thing you think the country needs to know about your uncle?
He's utterly incapable of leading this country, and it's dangerous to allow him to do so.
Based on what you see now or what you saw then?
Based on what I've seen my entire adult life.
Talk about the relationship between your father and his younger brother.
My dad was very patient with Donald.
He was about 8 years older?
About 7.5, 8, yeah. So it's a very big gap. You know, they were in practically different generations. They didn't travel in the same circles. But my dad, when they were younger, included him when he could. You know, especially when Donald was sort of at loose ends, when he was at Fordham and living at the house and didn't have a lot of friends, and Dad would ask his friends to invite him to dinner parties or take him out on the boat with his fraternity brothers fishing, when Donald was much younger. But I don't believe that they weren't close. And I think as soon as it became clear my father was not going to be able to continue a Trump management, and this would have been in the early 60s, I think Donald saw an opening. And I want to make something clear. This is very important to me. It's not that my dad wasn't good at it or had no interest in succeeding my grandfather in his company. He had every intention of being the next in line and working hard to make sure that he was successful in his father's business. My grandfather didn't give him a chance and made it impossible for my dad to succeed. And he was so miserable that he finally realized that, you know, he wasn't going to be given responsibility, he wasn't going to be given respect, so why stay? And that's when he opted to apply to TWA, which he did, and who accepted him right off the bat and moved him to Boston, and he flew the Logan LAX route, which was a big deal at the time. But because that was considered a betrayal, it didn't last.
Betrayal by your grandfather. President Trump wasn't a fan of it either. He says now, and he has said for the last couple of years, that he regrets the pressure he put on your father.
You should, but he was also following his dad's script. So Donald he just graduated from high school. So I can't fault him necessarily for doing what his father asked him to do. It was terrible to have put him in that position, certainly. What isn't okay is the revisionist history. You know, that Freddie was bad at it, and you know, we should have let him, as if Donald had any power over what my dad did. We should have let him do what he wanted to do, which again, at the time, they considered being a glorified bus driver. And also the way my dad is presented, I don't know that I've ever heard Donald talk about my dad as a pilot, as a member of the Air Force National Guard, or any of that. It's more as somebody who couldn't hack it in the family and lost his way.
Your father once dumped a plate of mashed potatoes on Donald's head?
Yeah, that's one of our favorite family stories. They were really young kids, and I think Donald was maybe 7. And one of his favorite things to do was torment my Uncle Rob, who was a couple of years younger. And it was, my grandmother was cooking dinner and getting the table ready, and Donald was just being merciless. And Marianne and my dad could not get him to stop. And finally, my dad had no other option but to pick up a bowl of mashed potatoes, and just dump it on his little brother's head. And it ended the fight, but I think it also started something, because Donald was humiliated by it, as evidenced by the way he reacts to this story now. Is no sense of humor about it whatsoever.
It came up when you were at the White House in April 2017?
Yes.
Who brought it up?
My Aunt Marianne. Yeah, and we know that he doesn't like the story, so I think it was a bit of a dig. It's also a way to remember my dad in a way that's not charged, because all of us except Donald think it's funny and sweet, but he doesn't like that story.
Election night 2016, I think you tweeted out, "It's the worst night of my life."
One of them, yeah.
One of the worst nights of my life. Then why go to the White House in April 2017?
Families are very complicated. I had been on the outside of this family for a really long time. And after my cousin Ivanka's wedding, which for reasons I still don't understand, I was invited to, my Aunt Marianne and I started talking. And we developed a relationship which we'd never had before, quite honestly. And it mattered to me, it was the first time I'd felt part of the family since I was a kid. And somehow it was very easy for me to put aside all of the things that had happened previous to that. And I enjoyed her company. She's funny, she's smart. And it just, when I got invited to her birthday party, I felt that I should go.
This is a hard question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is writing the book an extension of the dysfunction of the family?
Probably. I didn't write it as a form of therapy or anything like that. In fact, I would have preferred not to write it. It was quite difficult. And I sometimes feel I would have been better off not knowing some of the things I now know. But yeah, the book is absolutely born of the family dysfunction. Nobody can escape that. Obviously my generation was less affected than my father's. But we've been affected, and I'm not going to speak for anybody else in my generation. But it hasn't been easy, and it's an interesting question, and I think you're right. It is in part.
Your brother's not happy with the book.
I believe that my brother is entitled to his privacy and his opinion, and I am completely supportive of whatever relationship he has with my family and whatever choices he makes. It's none of my business. This is entirely my doing. I didn't consult anybody. Nobody knew in my family. Nobody knew it was happening. I didn't feel that I needed to ask permission by any stretch of the imagination, but I didn't want to implicate anybody. you know, this is my responsibility, and I believe very strongly that it's my obligation. But if other people don't feel that way, I completely respect that.
You do have one potentially explosive allegation in the book.